Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being here at our first ever episode of The Facts with Max. I am your host, Max Socol, candidate for District 18 State Senate. This web series is inspired by the sheer number of people who tell me when I come to their door to talk to them, I should pay more attention to state politics. We want to make it easier for you to do that. It's not easy to understand what's going on in our state most of the time. Sometimes that's by design. So we want to bring you some of the key issues that we're dealing with in the state of Maryland right to your Facebook feed, or if you're watching us on YouTube later, right to your YouTube feed to tell you more about what's at stake in this election and beyond. I also wanted to say before we get going and I introduce my guest that there's a context that we're in today, which is that the state Senate, as we speak, is actually making it harder for folks to engage directly if you don't live or work in Annapolis. We, during COVID, for a couple of years now, had the opportunity to offer video testimony at committee hearings where critical legislation gets heard. And just at the beginning of this week, Senate leadership decided no more of that. And who knows whether they're going to take it further and continue to reduce our access to committee rooms. And those committee rooms are where legislation really gets hammered out. And floor votes are the thing that happens at the end. So this campaign just stands against all of that secrecy, all of that restriction. We are all about transparency and openness and making it possible for people with families and jobs and lives to actually be part of the legislative process. So that is why we're here tonight. Like I said, for those just joining us, my name is Max Socol. I am the candidate for Maryland State Senate in District 18. We have lots of District 18 folks watching us live right now. And we're going to be doing a lot of these. So, my hope is that we can have policy experts on education and housing and criminal justice and public safety and many, many other topics that I know people want to talk about, come on with me and have these conversations. So please watch our emails, stay tuned. More announcements of future guests are coming. But right now, I want to introduce our first guest for this series. I couldn't be more excited. She is an amazing activist, social justice leader. You may know her from the work she did on passing the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which doubled Maryland's commitment to renewable energy. You might know her for her victorious fight against the Potomac Pipeline, which would have run through her hometown of Hagerstown, Maryland, and the leadership role that she played in the Don't Frack Maryland campaign. She has been the Environmental Justice Committee chair of Maryland NAACP, an organizer with Unite Here in the labor movement, Public Citizen, Jubilee Network, MoveOn.org, the Obama for America campaign. She has a resume a mile long and the experience to prove it. So I'm so grateful and glad that Brooke Harper agreed to be with us here tonight. Brooke, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And what we're going to talk about tonight is really, environmental justice, both writ large and also in the state of Maryland in the here and now, because there are some major changes coming to Maryland budgets and laws. And a lot of folks here are curious to know more about what we as constituents and regular folks can do to be part of that work. So thank you again for being here. Thanks all the folks who are joining us live. Again, please ask questions at any point in the chat. We'll capture those for the end. But the first question that I want to ask you, Brooke, is, let's start at the beginning, at the definitional level. So when we talk about environmental justice and overburdened communities is the term you hear a lot in environmental justice work. What does that term overburdened communities actually mean? And what can Maryland do to intervene on that issue?
So the technical term for overburdened communities is when we're talking about minority, low-income, tribal, or indigenous populations or geographic regions that experience disproportionate environmental harms and risk. But what that looks like on the ground level is really communities in Curtis Bay that are suffering from 24 polluting industries. It looks like a cluster of power plants in a 13-mile radius in Brandywine. I recently had the pleasure to meet with an activist who lives in the Sand Roads area in Lothian, Maryland. And when I visited her, what I saw was truck traffic. Later finding out that they allow about 390 diesel trucks a day to go up and down that road, which is like a 12-mile stretch of road, to service sand and gravel mine pits. There's also a landfill that was capped with asbestos, and five mobile home parks that only use one wastewater treatment center. And we went and walked down by the Patuxent River, and that wastewater was being discharged directly into the Patuxent. And when you have clusters of pollution like that, what you're looking at is decreased health outcomes. And COVID really laid that bare of how the compound crisis of the pandemic as well as the climate crisis really came together, because in communities that were overburdened with pollution, you saw higher rates of COVID deaths. So you actually saw where climate pollution was leading to higher rates of death in BIPOC and low income communities. And one of the critical first steps that Maryland needs to take is to actually identify overburdened communities. One of the ways that we're allowed to pass the buck and not really intervene is because we don't have definitions for environmental justice communities, or we don't have definitions for overburdened communities, which has hamstringed our legislator to say, we don't know what an overburdened community is, or there's not an official definition of overburdened communities. So how can we prioritize those communities for remediation? So the very first step that Maryland needs to do is actually to come up with the criteria that they use to define overburdened communities. And we need to look at a whole host of issues. Maryland is fortunate to have Dr. Jacoby Wilson, who developed the EJ mapping screen, which is one of the foremost tools to identify overburdened communities. But unfortunately, our environmental agencies haven't, and our legislature hasn't codified that. There are efforts underway to do that now, but we really need to say who are the communities that are overburdened. And we need to look at factors such as income, such as the race and socioeconomic demographics, as well as what are the polluting industries there, because they're really compound crises. And after we identify overburdened communities, we need to go out to these communities and have stakeholder conversations about what are the ways that we can undo some of the harms. Maryland has tried to put forth cumulative impacts legislation. And those of you who aren't familiar with cumulative impacts, it's where you have communities that like Sand Roads, like Brandywine, like Curtis Bay, that are just inundated with pollution. And when a company or polluting industry comes in, we don't even look at what's already there, and what the impacts already are on those communities. So we need to take steps.
So new companies coming in just get analyzed in a vacuum if they need permits or something like that.
So opening up those lines of communications, having a more holistic view about when we're making decisions, especially when it comes to overburdened communities, and really moving forward beyond just defining them, and really moving forward to undo the harm that was done and invest in those communities.
Are there models out there or states out there that are doing this well in terms of both identifying overburdened communities and then finding ways to regulate differently once that's been done?
New Jersey has really had the gold standard. What they did was they defined overburdened and environmental justice communities by looking at what's the level of English proficiency, what's the socioeconomic status, what's the racial demographic, and that triggered additional reviews in their environmental process. And then they're also allocating investments into those communities and doing a whole agency landscape and working with agencies to make sure that it's also triggering that decision making where they're taking into account cumulative impacts and environmental justice into their decision making. So we have the models. Ben Grumbles has said New Jersey is the gold standard. We need that gold standard here in Maryland because our communities are suffering. We don't need further studies or commissions or discussions. We've literally been having the debate over how to define environmental justice communities for nearly a decade. And we have the tools, we need the will, and for our legislature to act on that.
I have so many more questions just about that, but I want to keep us going through some of the other topics we had talked about. So one of the things that you do that I think is really exciting, I know folks who are here tonight want to know about, is this Justice 40 framework. So just to briefly define some terms, the Justice 40 framework, it's a demand of the Biden administration that at least 40% of federal climate investments that are coming from the various recovery bills that have been passed go directly to frontline communities who have been most impacted by poverty and pollution. And you're one of the people who's working to make that a reality in Maryland as those federal dollars come. So what can you tell us about climate investments in our state? What's here now, what's coming, and how can legislators and progressive allied organizations working on the outside actually support making Justice 40 a reality for Maryland?
I think we need to start by preparing for the federal funding that will be flowing into Maryland in the coming months as a result of the Infrastructure Act. We have hundreds of millions of dollars that will be flowing into our state that can be invested in EV infrastructure, transportation, weatherization, workforce development, and several other clean energy investments. And our job is really to ensure that these investments are prioritized in overburdened communities that are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. One of the things, and many of our legislators have done it, but we need to be putting things in our legislation that we're introducing right now and creating programs and able to be able to leverage and access those funds. I also think additional outreach needs to be done in rural communities like mine to make sure that they have the same access as larger counties and that we're reaching out to community organizations and community partners and connecting them with the expertise in order to leverage some of those competitive grants and bring those priority investments home. And we need to legislate it and codify that when we're receiving these funds, that we're prioritizing these communities, especially overburdened frontline, BIPOC, and rural communities that have been left behind. And we need to look at what are the projects that have been left off the table, like the Red Line, looking at retrofitting low-income housing, putting EV infrastructure in rural communities, and really working to deliver the promise of a clean energy future in these communities. And I think it takes a really focused, concentrated effort on especially like outreach to municipal leaders, outreach to our legislators to make sure that they're prioritizing bringing these funds home and that we're not missing out on this opportunity.
What would you say to, so my district's, it's like right in the heart of Montgomery County. It's a fairly urban, dense, it's a wealthier district in the state. And sometimes, with good intentions, I think that some of these issues can get demagogued occasionally when it comes to investments. Folks who live here feel like, hey, I want to make sure that we're getting our investments too here. What would you say to folks when we talk about the need to direct these kinds of investments very deliberately into underserved communities, rural communities, BIPOC communities across the state? Like, what's collectively, what's in that for all of us?
I think you have improved health outcomes for most overburdened communities, and we lift all boats. I think we really need to start looking at policy from the bottom up, because that's how we win. That's how we know that everybody is benefiting from these funds and from the policies that we make. And I think even in your district, there's low-income communities. There's if we have an electric school bus program, let's start with the, like, let's start in rural communities, let's start in low income communities, let's start in overburdened communities, converting those fleets. I think we can still bring the same investments, but we need to be dedicating those to the communities that have been most harmed by the climate crisis.
I think that's a good segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is it starts with a sad story, but it's something that I really think that in my district, we need to keep this in mind. It actually didn't happen in my district, but just to the north in Rockville. Last summer, we had really, really intense summer rainstorms here. Flash flooding that's supposedly like 100-year level or unprecedented, except that now it's happening every year, right? Because the climate crisis. And a young man named Melkin Cedillo drowned in a flood in Rockville. He was 19 years old, and his basement apartment in the Rock Creek Woods development in Rockville flooded along with dozens of other units, and he went back into the floodwaters to rescue his mother, and he tragically lost his life. So it's one sad example, but just one of many that we can point to where we see that folks who are working class, who are living in conditions or without the budgets necessarily to weatherize and climatize their own places that they live, bear the brunt of the climate crisis before many of the rest of us do. So what I want to ask you about that is, we have a lot of people tuned in tonight. I'm sure we'll have people watching later just because of the nature of this campaign who are very involved in racial justice struggles, very involved in environment and climate struggles. And all of us are organizers to some degree. People who know me know that I rarely call anybody an activist because, to me, it's about organizing. So when we are organizing each other and our communities for these struggles, like, what are the things that we can be doing to better knit them together and understand that climate and environment are racial justice issues and vice versa?
I think the first thing and foremost is listen. We really need to listen to BIPOC communities that know that these issues are inextricably linked, and to not only listen, but learn and let communities lead the way. We held a focus group a few months ago with frontline and fence line communities, and one participant said that, like, we will fail unless we are building our climate and transportation policies from the bottom up. I think oftentimes advocates come to communities with solutions instead of letting communities lead the way. And when BIPOC, low income, and rural voices aren't at the table, when we develop policies, then we fail those communities and we fail to really address the systemic racism and the impacts that it's had and the far-reaching impacts that it's had on those communities. It's no accident that the red line was cut and canceled, leaving Baltimore residents disconnected from economic opportunity. It's no accident that highways and polluting industries and the fossil fuel industry are placed in BIPOC communities. And there's those, like I said, it's inextricably linked. And as advocates, I think we must understand, like, the deep roots of systemic racism and its impact on communities. And we have to work even harder to have a future free of race-based policies and understand and that there's a difference, but the outcome is the same. Like, we can't breathe with a police officer on our neck. We can't breathe with facilities and incinerators and fossil fuel industries. And it's intentional. And, like, we need to start making those connections, that they are linked, and that the climate crisis and its impact on BIPOC and low income communities is linked to systemic racism. There's a reason why these polluting industries were placed there, or why highways have been cut through neighborhoods. It's to disenfranchise them. And we need to really start to make those linkages and listen and share our stories. I think that's one way that advocates really need to come to the table, is by listening first, and really letting communities talk about the impacts. And we also, I think, need to have, Maryland has one of the most diverse legislatures ever. And I think we also need to talk to our BIPOC leaders in the state house about why aren't you listening to these issues when it comes to environmental justice? There's no reason why we should have incineration. There's no reason why the University of Maryland should be receiving a gas pipeline. There's no reason why rural communities are inundated with fossil fuel. And I think part of it is holding our elected officials accountable to how the climate crisis is impacting BIPOC communities, and they need to listen to their constituents. And know that this is a life or death issue, just like economics, just like police brutality for these communities, and put it at the same level because they're all crises that are really coming together and compounding these communities.
You said, you mentioned that word accountability. And I think for many of the people involved in this campaign, we feel like that's why we're here. But I would love to dig into this a little bit more with you because I am really curious. I think we all want to see environmental justice solutions. All of us here want to see environmental justice solutions moving forward. We understand that the climate crisis is here now. We don't have time, like you said, for more studies and commissions. But in a real way, we also don't have time for accountability to only take the form of elections and even primaries and whatnot, right? Like we actually need a critical mass of current legislators to do the kinds of things you're talking about, to really listen to frontline communities and involve them in the lawmaking process. So what do you think the barriers or the impediment, what's going on in the State House, I guess, to put it bluntly, that is keeping lawmakers from doing more of that?
I think it's a lack of resourced organizations that have, and community organizations who are bearing the brunt of these like polluting industries, to be able to have the capacity to go to candidate forums, to go to hearings. It's very hard when you're fighting to save your backyard and put dinner on the table and to do all of those things. And sometimes I think it's missed by our legislators what our communities are going through, especially overburdened communities when there's health impacts. So we've had several activists that are literally too sick to work on the issue from the pollutants that they're breathing in every day. And I think there needs to be greater education. I think as advocacy organizations and in the funding world, we need to prioritize giving greater capacity to groups so that they can mobilize, so that they can hold their elected officials accountable. And that should be, as progressive organizations, the service that we're providing, and really putting those voices up front and getting that access. And I think our legislators really need to listen to the harm that's been done and see that as just as important as every other issue. I think they're able to turn a blind eye because BIPOC communities are fighting a lot of issues. But we need to prioritize this one. And we also need to make sure that our legislators are prioritizing it. We have Speaker Jones, who has the Black economic agenda. We also need a Black climate agenda. How are we lifting up BIPOC workers and making sure that they're being invested in, and that we're giving them the C-suite positions, and that we're also, not continuing to harm their communities. And I think that needs to be throughout our legislature.
You brought up some issues around economics and jobs, and I think that's a good segue to our last big question for tonight before we turn it over to Q&A from folks who are watching. I think we all understand that occasionally it can be tough for progressives, for our movement, to bring together a fight for a climate future with the fights that we also deeply care about being in solidarity with unions and building workplace democracy and making sure that, number one, when jobs come to Maryland, they're good union jobs. And number two, that we are increasing the number of good union jobs to make sure that everybody can get into the middle class and we don't have exploitative labor practices in our state. So both those things are true. But occasionally it feels like we search in vain for some common ground on certain particular projects or tough, spots, shutting down coal-fired power plants, highway construction, things like that. So what needs to happen in our legislature so that Maryland can lead on both the climate and on the union climate?
Well, as a former union organizer, I think one of the things I learned is one, unions are suffering here in Maryland and suffering all over the nation, and they're being weakened, and jobs are leaving communities. In my own hometown of Hagerstown, we've had a lot of industry leave, and there's a lack of good family sustaining jobs aside from like Volvo or the prison. There's not a lot of pathways, and there's not a lot of ways to really carve out a future where you can sustain a family. And I saw as labor unions were really weighing heavy decisions. It's not that labor unions aren't aware that the climate crisis is happening, but I think they are asking themselves, when you shut down a coal plant, where are the workers going to go? And I don't think we've had the right answers, and I don't think we've had adequate answers. How do you say that you're going to lose your job and then we're going to put you through training, but is that going to ensure that you're able to support your family? Is that going to lead to another job? And I think we keep coming up with question marks instead of answers, and we need our legislature to work for those answers. And to have a just transition fund, as other states have set up to help foster in a just transition. I also think we really need to have industry and labor together. I think the Clean Energy Jobs Act was a wonderful example of that, where we really came together. I'll never forget, like, working on apprenticeship program language and then going back to Hagerstown and fighting on the Potomac pipeline, where some of the same labor members that we were just talking with were now on opposite sides. And I remember seeing, it was like really upset, and I was like, like they're here, and and then I was like, why are they fighting this so hard? And I was like, they're fighting for their livelihoods. And my job is not to stop their livelihoods. My job is to ensure that as we transition to a clean energy economy, that those communities and those workers are also left whole. And I think our legislature needs to take that seriously. And I think industry needs to come to the table with labor and offer high road jobs and family sustaining jobs. I think we saw that with the revitalization of Sparrows Point, where that's going to be the home to like 500 good union jobs. And I think we need to continue to build on those like victories. Like, that's a prime example of where unions have been weakened when the steel industry left, and we're bringing it back, and we're bringing it back with clean energy jobs. And we need that to get across the solar industry. We need that across all of our green industries. And it's not just worker training. It's like, can we guarantee that after that training, you will have a job that sustains your family? And I think environmentalists also need to push for those same standards. We push for greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Are we also pushing for labor standards? And I think that's the road that we need to take, and to encourage and to walk in lockstep with each other. It was really great to sit at Sparrows Point and see that come to life. That's why I do this work, because there's got to be a way that we can have family sustaining jobs and healthy communities. And so I think we need to make those inroads and have our legislature really navigate some of the tension between industry and labor, and make sure that when we are creating clean energy industries in Maryland, that we're creating family sustaining jobs, that we're hiring locally, that we're offering benefits. And I think that goes hand in hand with climate justice. Like, justice is not having a coal plant shut down. Justice is having that community, making sure there's coal plant remediation and that they're doing the cleanup, making sure that workers have a transition, or that workers are left whole and they have benefits as they have to make a transition to a new job. And I think I don't think they can leave without a safety net at this point. And I think we need to work harder to provide a safety net for our workers as we're transitioning to a clean energy economy.
Thank you. I feel like you have such a unique perspective, having been both on the labor and the environment side. I'm warning our live participants that we're going to move to Q&A in a sec, so go ahead and get your questions in. But I want to follow up on something you said, Brooke. You mentioned in passing a few different things that are in the works or could be in the works in the legislature to try to bring these sides together. Things like prevailing wage standards on renewable industry jobs. Things like what was the other one that you said very quickly? Just transition funds. So in the past we've had just transition funds, but they've been pretty small. And now with Annapolis, with the legislature having more budgeting power, there's at least hypothetically the chance to make those funds larger. There's also always progressive taxation, which anybody who's ever had me at their door knows I will talk about given any opportunity, like raising revenue. It's a big piece of the puzzle here. We know that. Something you didn't mention, but that I feel like is part of this too, is free public college and university in Maryland, like making sure that we actually have an educational system for folks who want to continue their educations, to be able to do that without taking on debt or paying tuition money they don't have, right? Like all these things are different fixes that we can put into place to make this easier. But it sounded like you were also saying we need the legislature to create the end-to-end pathway. Don't just like give me the fixes and little pieces here and there, but actually explain, I mean, not to you, but to unions, to workers, like we're going to shut this coal plant down and this is what's going to happen, so that you can be confident that you will find a good job that will bring you into or keep you in the middle class in the state of Maryland. So is that what you're saying? And are there examples of that happening? What could that look like? I mean, not an easy question to answer, but I'm curious.
There are examples of that happening. Several states have set up like just transition funds and invested like significant amounts of money in order to like offer job training. In my neighboring state of West Virginia, they're offering for co-workers to actually get training in cybersecurity jobs because there's a lack of jobs in that area, and training them so they can go right into those jobs. I think it's a combination of one, making sure that our industries, our clean energy industries, are holding up a high standard, but also making sure that our legislature, we have this budget surplus. We know that these coal plant closures are coming down the line. So can we put something aside to protect those workers, something significant? And not only just the workers, but the communities as well, that are also going to be economically impacted by the closure of those coal plants, and really looking at the holistic picture. I think sometimes that we look at establishing a working group or doing another study, and that doesn't feed a family. That doesn't replace a job. And I think we need to come to grips with that and say we need to do better. We need to do better for our union brothers and sisters and in the environmental community. We need to walk in lockstep with them and fight together. There's going to be some issues that we may not come together on. But for the issues where we can stand together, to really stand together and not just have the environmental policies make it across the finish line, but make sure the equity provisions in our policies get past the finish line, make sure the labor provisions in our policies get past our finish line. And that takes a unified movement, and that's yet to be built, but we're going to build it.
From your lips to God's ears. Thank you so much for answering my questions, Brooke. And I'm going to now turn to the chat and throw a few questions to you from folks who have been watching along. Okay, so this is a question about the Justice 40 piece of this conversation. How do we know that the federal money that gets earmarked for the issues you've been talking about will actually get to people. So, and this is still the question, if I understand correctly, lots of COVID funds didn't actually make it or got held up for a long time at the county, maybe the state level by various officials in various places. So how can we know that the climate investments are really making it into communities?
I think we need to have accountability with our legislature around and tracking of where these funds are going. We also need to really ensure that our municipalities and our NGOs and our state agencies are prepared to access these funds that we're putting in programs. And I think we also need to really uplift the voice and resource those overburdened communities to make sure that they're prioritized. And I think that goes back to some of the things we originally talked about with accountability and how are we getting those community voices and elected officials together to really prioritize that federal funding. Right now, for Justice 40, a lot of the grants are available now for EPA, from the EPA for some of those programs. And the way Build Back Better and the Infrastructure Act are built is that it's kind of great that, you know, they're looking for equity standards, they're looking for high road labor standards and Buy America efforts and things like that, in order to make that process more geared toward providing labor and equity standards in the programming. And so I really think that's all of us really taking a more active and engaged role in how this federal funding is spent. And I think a lot of it is education. So one, educating the communities, educating our municipal leaders, and really demanding of our state agencies what they should be prioritizing. I mean, Hogan right now has control of a lot of latitude with the budget, but that's not going to be so in the coming years. And how I think we need to be, one, putting the right folks in office as we come up on the next election, and two, really working to make sure that we're holding them accountable to bringing those funds home where they can do the most good, and that we're preparing those organizations and agencies and municipalities to be able to have the technical expertise to access those funds.
Yeah, great. And join an organization. That's what I would say to the person who asked that question, and all of us, you know, join your local climate group, your local mutual aid group, join 350, join your Sunrise Hub, join your DSA chapter. You know, lots of organizations get really into the weeds on these investments at a local level, and we can't do it alone. So, you know, if this is something you care about, look up who are the leaders in your community who work on this every day. Brooke, if you live in Hagerstown, you know, here's somebody. But wherever you live, there's somebody who really follows this stuff, and join their organization. So we have one more question coming from the moderator here. Oh, this is a good one too. So how effective do you think environmental impact statements are? Would it be more effective in addressing environmental justice to seek racial equity impact statements for all legislation, which we have in Montgomery County and seems to be having a positive effect? I guess this is a state level question.
I think environmental impact studies are an important legal tool for fights. When we were fighting like the Potomac pipeline, looking at that, and as we fight like national fossil fuel fights, I think they're gravely important. We also entered legislation to do health impact assessments, but there does need to be a racial equity assessment. We can see clearly from our mapping tools that it's BIPOC, low income, and rural communities that are suffering the most. And so I do think we need to be taking race into consideration and to look at the equity impacts of all of our decision making. So I think that would be a strong step in the right direction.
And when we say environmental impact statement, is that the same thing as, I know there's been legislation, you know, under consideration in Annapolis to add, you know, environmental climate analysis to every bill in the same way we currently do with a fiscal analysis and small business analysis, or are impact statements separate from that idea?
So impact, there's two. So there's like federal environmental impact statements that agencies have to do, state environmental impact statements for major projects. But I think probably what you're referring to is how are we taking this into consideration, like how are agencies taking this into consideration? Right now, there's legislation being introduced to look at what are the climate equity and labor impacts of agency decision making that we hope will progress forward this year, because it's vitally important for all agencies to look at it. What if we looked at our transportation lens through climate? Would we be trying to expand highways and not investing in, instead of investing in like public transit? If we looked at equity, where would we be placing those highways? And would we have good labor standards for those workers? And so I think it needs to be a holistic approach where we're looking at climate, where we're looking at equity, and where we're looking at labor, and how are we building the best Maryland that we can as we're moving forward and transitioning to a clean energy economy.
Brooke, thank you so much for coming on with me tonight. Looks like we have answered all of our queue of audience questions. I'm just so grateful for your time and for the work that you're doing in Annapolis, and the fact that you stepped away from that to come talk with us. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you and good luck.
Thank you. So I'm going to let Brooke off the hook. And I just want to close out by saying that, you know, this campaign, as you've heard, it's essential for us to be involved, not just in the elections process, but throughout the legislative process in Annapolis as well. It's something I really believe in as a longtime organizer, somebody who's worked in different state legislatures. I've seen it up close. And we're going to bring more folks like Brooke on to talk to us about other key issues coming down the line in Annapolis. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that. I also see some very kind chats from people. I would be remiss if I didn't remind us all that this is a tough campaign. We are up against very powerful forces in Maryland running a primary for state Senate. And so I'm very grateful to some folks who are messaging me to say that they donated to the campaign. If you would like to donate to the campaign as well, I believe one of our staff people, there she is, thank you, Custodia, is dropping links in the chat. We are also looking for volunteers. We've got canvases coming up every weekend this month and next month. Some exciting news about our first canvas in March that I hope we can drop really soon. So you can always check out max4senate.com. That's for like the number 4 to get all those updates. And we will post this online as soon as we get it uploaded. So once we get it up, please let your friends know. This is a fascinating discussion, and we would love to have them come check it out as well. So thank you all so much.